In the summer of 1932, at the height of the Great Depression, an impoverished army of 45,000 World War I veterans marched on Washington, D.C.
They believed that if they came to Congress, that Congress would finally authorize immediate payment of bonds that they had been promised for the losses that they suffered during World War I.
But Congress refused to pay the bonus, and the Army brutally drove the veterans away.
It's war, the greatest concentration of fighting troops in Washington since 1865.
This is the saga of the Bonus Army, and a march that changed the nation.
Remember my forgotten man. You put a rifle in his hand. Forgotten, help me see, means you're forgetting me like my forgotten.
Major funding for this program was provided by the Disabled American Veterans National Service Foundation. Since World War I, DAV has helped veterans recover from the wounds and scars of war. DAV, building better lives for America's disabled veterans and their families. Additional production support provided by Tawani Foundation, promoting the ideal of the citizen soldier at the Pritzker Military Library, Chicago, Illinois, and by the Humanities Council of Washington, D.C.
America was not prepared when it entered World War I in 1917. Fighting the Germans required young American men by the millions, and the only way to get them was through conscription.
The American Army, for the first time in its history, will be composed of a majority of conscripted troops. And when the draft is explained to the American people, it's called selective service.
Some men were selected to fight, others to work in needed defense industries, or as farmers.
So it's a different conception of military service as work, as opposed to just simply a civic duty.
The first American troops arrived in France in June of 1917. In just 18 months, nearly 100,000 lost their lives. 200,000 more were wounded or gassed. Also, over there, were hundreds of thousands of African-American soldiers. Barred from combat with American units, many fought courageously under the French flag.
For the first time, many of these people experienced what it was like to be treated as fully human beings by white people.
When the armistice was signed on November 11, 1918, most of the Americans that had served would never be the same. As the first waves of troops returned from Europe, the nation turned out to honor them with parades. But veterans quickly realized the high price they had paid.
Let's say a guy didn't go to war, stayed home, worked in an arms factory. He would probably get maybe 10 times as much as a soldier would. Soldier in combat was getting about a buck and a quarter a day.
Soon after the war, veterans began to argue that soldiers should be compensated for the wages they lost while serving their country.
They very carefully used the terms adjusted compensation to be clear that what they are asking for is not a bonus. They are asking for back wages that are due to them. It was the detractors who called it a bonus.
Finally, in 1924, Congress granted World War I veterans adjusted universal compensation.
A law had granted them the bonus, equivalent to $1 to $1.25 a day for every day they served, which in many cases would be $600, $800, $1,000.
But there was a catch.
They don't get a nickel of the money until 1945, unless they die. That's what they call it, the tombstone bonus.
In 1928, Herbert Clark Hoover, a self-made millionaire, was elected president. In his inaugural address, Hoover proclaimed that the future of the country was bright with hope. Just 7 months later, the stock market collapsed, and the country descended into the Great Depression. In America, in 1932, hunger and desperation stalked the land. 25% of workers were unemployed, and many were veterans. One of them was Walter W. Waters, down on his luck in Portland, Oregon.
He had been a sergeant in the war, and that's an indication that you were a pretty good soldier. And there were a lot of veterans sitting around trying to find what to do next.
Then came a ray of hope. A bill calling for an immediate cash payment of the veterans' bonus was introduced in Congress. Waters became obsessed with it.
During this time, I was anxiously watching reports in the newspapers of the progress of bonus legislation. And I noticed that the highly organized lobbies in Washington were producing results, regardless of the justice or injustice of the demand.
At a meeting of jobless veterans, Waters stood up and urged them to march on Washington.
And when that happened, it kind of clicked for these guys. Eventually, there were about 300 of them. And they go down to the railroad yard to hop freights. And they go all the way across the country to Washington.
Once I built a railroad, I made it run.
They called themselves the Bonus Expeditionary Force, or BEF, a play on the American Expeditionary Force, the collective name for the troops sent to France. But soon, they were simply known as the Bonus Army. They carried knapsacks or duffel bags or bedrolls with tin cups dangling. They had $30 among them. Meanwhile, word of the BEF was spreading. Even as Waters and his men were heading towards the Capitol, 25 vets from Tennessee were circling the White House in a truck bearing the sign, "We want our bonus."
And they start from everywhere. They start from Los Angeles. They start from Las Vegas. They start from Mississippi and Texas. They come from everywhere.
Antonio Oliver, a veteran gassed in the Argonne Forest in France, drove from Pennsylvania with his twin sons, Nick and Joe.
My dad got word to march on Washington and dump the tub for the bonus that they promised the veterans in 1924.
And I think it was approaching dawn when he got there. And my father woke us up and says, "There's the Capitol building." I never forgot that.
While streams of bonus marchers headed toward the Capitol, Pelham Glassford, the new D.C. police chief, prepared for their invasion.
I had been aware from the first that the BEF was symbolic of the vast army of unemployed. Anything unfortunate that happened might easily precipitate widespread social disorder.
Pelham Glassford was a decorated brigadier general during World War I who commanded the loyalty of his men in a very personal way.
Glassford was really pleased in many ways that the veterans were coming to Washington. But he knew that the politicians were not sympathetic.
Officials were also concerned that a large number of African-American veterans were mixed in with the marchers.
And the irony is that going back to the Great War, the African-American troops were segregated from the white troops.
Also preparing for the bonus army was a prominent World War I veteran, General Douglas A. MacArthur.
The United States Army, through its Military Intelligence Division, remained greatly concerned about the possibility of revolution. The Army developed a plan to defend the United States Capitol in the case of civil insurrection. And they were talking about using tanks, machine guns, gas.
By the time the bonus marchers arrived in Washington, the Army was more than ready to deal with them.